This is Audible.
Audible Studios presents Heaven's River, Book 4 in the Bobbiverse series. Written by Dennis E. Taylor. Performed by Ray Porter. Part 1. The Search for Bender. 1. Frenemies. Jacques. November 2331, New Pav. The planet hung below, all blues and greens and twinkling lights of nascent cities. New Pav, we called it. The Pav's name for their new home planet was slightly more poetic, but would still sound like a bunch of spitting and hissing to a human ear. The population had boomed in the 70 years or so since they'd been resettled here, and they now boasted cities on several continents. It looked like the species would survive. Whether they'd still be talking to us or not was another matter. I received a signal from the cargo drone containing my Manny, informing me that it had landed. With a mental sigh, I prepared to leave VR for what would probably be an uncomfortable meeting with the PAV representative. I connected to the Manny, a remotely operated android, over the SCUT channel and transferred my personal POV into it. As internal systems powered up, I took a mill to glance around the now familiar cargo hold, then extracted myself from the support rack. The cargo doors opened automatically to reveal my usual PAV military escort, rifles at the ready, probably with safeties off. A gaggle of 6-foot-tall meerkats, without the cute. I hadn't visited in a couple of decades, mostly because the last time had been what you might call tense. Just to see how they'd react, I smiled, careful not to show my teeth, and gave them the Vulcan salute. The squad leader showed me his teeth, not a gesture of friendship from a PAV, and returned the salute with 3 fewer fingers. Apparently he had studied human culture. I walked up to the group and gave them a proper PAV smile equivalent. "Hey guys, what's shaking?" I needn't have bothered. The squad leader responded with a low snarl and motioned with his weapon toward the nearby tent. They'd set up a tent. It would seem I didn't even rate an indoor meeting. Maybe it was actually a good sign. Nope, couldn't make that work. I entered the enclosure and eyed the PAV sitting at the desk. He was the second planetary administrator since Hasjiar, and he didn't look any friendlier than his immediate predecessor. I missed Hasjiar. She at least had understood the realities of the situation the PAV found themselves in. Somehow, since her passing, the part about the others having rendered the original PAV homeworld unlivable had been, de-emphasized. The prevailing attitude now seemed to be that we'd done it and lied about it, for no reason that anyone could come up with.
"My name is Asmahiz," he said, gesturing to a chair. "I represent all PAV. Do you represent the humans?"
"I am Jacques Johansson. I represent the humans for purposes of this transaction." It was a PAV formality of sorts. Everyone identified themselves and their purpose, and it lowered the tension a bit as we settled into the routine. Asma pushed some papers forward.
"We have available the agreed to tonnages of elements according to the schedule. This represents payment in full for the 2 human-owned auto factories in our system. Do you concur?"
I glanced over the papers. Everything seemed to be in order. We'd offered to just give the auto factories to the PAV, but they'd refused. I couldn't be sure if it was an aversion to what could be seen as charity, or if they didn't want to be in our debt, even morally. I suspected the latter. "I concur. The Bellerophon will be here within the year. They will collect the ingots and deliver the auto factories to you from orbit." We stared at each other across the desk. There would be no pleasantries exchanged today. Then Asma finally spoke.
"I will admit this agreement is inconsistent with the prevailing conspiracy theory about the Bobs. It would have made more sense for you to keep us planet-bound and ignorant.
Hopefully, this will help to ease the tension between our peoples, I replied.
A little, I think.
Asma gave me a tight-lipped smile equivalent.
I have read the diaries of Hastiar, Jock. She did not feel that you were the enemy, but it is a minority viewpoint these days.
I sighed and examined my hands for a moment. Asma, you'll be able to build interstellar vessels with the autofactories. We've given you the construction programs as part of the deal. It's just... I looked up at him. You'll be going out into a galactic neighborhood that's full of humans, and getting more so. Too much uncontrolled antagonism could be counterproductive, you know? He stared back at me for a moment.
I understand, Jock. We are outnumbered and outgunned, if it comes to that. We are not,
Asma gazed upward for a moment, then smiled.
Klingons. Is that the right human term? We understand discretion.
I smiled back, just as one of my honor guard muttered,
And patience.
Asma gave them a hard glare past my shoulder. We have made great strides in restoring the PAV homeworld, I said, trying to bring things back to an even keel. About a third of the planet is actively growing things once again. Are you sure you don't want... Asma shook his head.
In our own time, Jock, we will visit our ancestral home. I don't doubt the skills of the Bobs, but this is the home world of every living PAV. Old PAV is a monument to what no longer is.
I understand. I nodded and stood up. It will be kept aside for you for whenever you decide. I turned to my escort. Well, boys, shall we? The squad leader showed me his teeth, again, and stepped aside to make room for my departure. I turned back to Asma for a moment, and we exchanged PAV head bobs. I found myself missing Hashiar and her version of the Vulcan salute. Ephemerals. It was so hard not to think it. There was a clunk as my cargo drone docked with the comms station. In keeping with the increased use of Manny's for local physical presence, stations were now being constructed with a living area of sorts and docking facilities. I stepped out of the drone's hold and walked over to the Manny pod. For humanoid androids, the pods had pretty much replaced the older and bulkier storage racks. As the pod cover closed over me, umbilicals and feeder tubes attached to the Manny. I powered down and transferred my POV to my personal VR. My latest VR environment, a ski chalet, was already boring me. It seemed I couldn't stay interested for long in any one theme, and I couldn't get up the energy to work on something grand. I sighed and reset the VR to the default library theme. On a whim, I sent a text to Ferb. He replied immediately, and I popped over to the PAV Reclamation Project Administration Center. The center was hosted by Bill's Moot VR system and had been the nexus for our efforts to rebuild the PAV homeworld for almost 100 years now. I examined the empty room, a sense of nostalgia filling me. We'd spent so many years working on the problem of rebooting the PAV ecology from nothing more than some plant and animal samples, taken in a huge rush as the others' armada bore down on the planet. It was ironic. Now that we were finally making some significant progress, the PAVs simply didn't seem to care. Ferb popped in as I stood, ruminating. "Hey, bud," he said. "Long time." "Yeah, I waved a hand at the room. Ghosts. It feels like we just abandoned the PAV. Don't get melodramatic, Jacques. It's all pretty much automated these days. Takes maybe a couple of hours a month to make sure everything's on track. Uh-huh. And that's why, right? Where's Phineas these days, Ferb? He glared at me. Why'd you have to bring that up? Because it's the real reason why this place is deserted. Heard from Phineas? Nothing live. Ferb looked down. He isn't bothering to build interstellar relays, and he's way the hell out of scut range now. I get a heavily Dopplered radio transmission every month or so, though. Heading for the large Magellanic Cloud, he'll be a while. What's your point, Jacques? You, me, Phineas, Claude, we're all haunted by what happened. Ghosts. Billions of PAV. We did everything we could. I sighed. I know. But there's still an emotional toll. Especially since the PAV haven't exactly embraced us for our efforts. We've all, every one of us who were involved, gone on to other things as far removed from this as possible. Phineas, well, I snorted. He's taken far, a bit too far, maybe. Ferb nodded, the slightest trace of a smile showing for only an instant. I cocked my head as I took a good look at him. What are you doing with yourself these days? LARPing. Well, designing campaigns more than participating. Now Ferb finally did smile. The gamers, Gandalf and his group do live-action D&D campaigns in Vert, but they kind of have a problem where they all want to play and no one wants to DM, so they're happy enough for the help, and What? I have to admit I get a little uncomfortable around them sometimes. Not that they're dangerous, it's just they're like strangers, but strangers who all look like me, Some of them are out-and-out jerks. Yeah. Replicative drift. It's a thing, as Bill says. So why do you work with them? He shrugged. Something to do. Keeps me busy. You can't find anything better to do with your time? Thanks for that, Mom. Ferb hesitated. Actually, I'm kind of working on something. Not quite ready yet. Don't noise it around, okay? He had my interest now. Okay. I'm building a huge cargo vessel for myself, and I'm filling it with scut relays, stripped down to the essentials to keep their size down. When I'm ready, I'm going to launch straight up toward Galactic North. I'll drop off relays as I go. I want to get at least 1,000 light years above the galactic plane, then I'll be able to see what's on the other side of the galaxy. You could just put an AMI in the vessel, give it some marching orders, and stay home. Maybe not the same, though. Or maybe you're right about Phineas. And all of us, maybe we are trying to run away. Ferb gave me a look that I would have to describe as pleading, as if he was asking for forgiveness or something. Gotta go, Jacques. We'll talk again sometime. For some reason, I doubted that would happen. And just like that, I was alone again in the PRP center. Alone with my ghosts. 2. Working the options. Bob, January 2296, above Eden. Space is big. I know, that sounds like a duh statement, and Douglas Adams already made it anyway, but when you're looking for a single spaceship over literally interstellar distances, space gets right in your face with its bigness. Bender had been missing now for more than 100 years. Despite Bill transmitting the SCUT plans for FTL communication to every system that Bender could possibly have reached, despite searches along his probable path by Victor and later by his clone mates Marvin and Luke, we hadn't found hide nor hair of Bender. Or bolt or deck plate, what with him actually being a sentient spaceship and all. I should explain that, I guess. Bender is a computer who thinks he's one Robert Johansson, an engineer/nerd who died in the early 21st century. As are all the Bobs, including me. I was the first replicant, launched from Earth in 2133. Every single Bob is my descendant because that's what von Neumann probes do. We make copies. We're up to thousands of Bobs now, spread over an almost 100 light-year radius centered around the Sol system. Bender was from my second batch of clones, constructed in Delta Eridani. He took off in the direction of Gamma Leporis A, and he's never been heard from again. Lots of Bobs have died over the years in battles, and some without the benefit of a backup, but Bender just disappeared without a trace and without a reason. I knew Bender's original destination, but then so did Victor, Marvin, and Luke, and they hadn't found diddly. Specifically, they couldn't find any sign that he'd ever reached Gamma Leporis A. No auto factory setup, no mining activity, no communications relay station, and no Bussard trail in or out of the system. I had just returned to Delta Eridani after my big pilgrimage back to Earth. It had been an emotionally loaded trip for me. The Earth would probably be drastically altered once it came out of this ice age, so in a way it was my last visit to my home in any recognizable form. It was ironic that humanity had solved the global warming problem by implementing a nuclear winter and killed off 99.9% of themselves in the process, but who's keeping score anymore? Stupid humans. The Delta Eridani system was pretty much as I'd left it. Autofactory support systems continued to collect raw materials from the asteroids, ferrying them back to be formed into ingots against any future need. In the absence of any specific orders, the autofactories slowly produced more autofactories and spare parts for all my various mechanical servants. Satisfied with the status quo, I invoked my virtual reality system and settled into my lazy boy recliner, surrounded by my library. Shelves full of books, floor to ceiling, never failed to relax me. Spike immediately jumped up and settled herself on my lap, purring contentedly, and Jeeves brought a fresh coffee. The VR environment was an essential part of my existence. Without it, I was just a disembodied mind. In VR, I had a body, and pets, and a home. And before the addition of the personal VR, 4 out of 5 replicants went insane. I'm pretty sure there's a connection. "Sorry, bud, but I need to concentrate right now," I said to the cat. I turned to Guppy, who was standing at parade rest, as usual. "Suspend Spike's program and bring up a representation of the stellar neighborhood centered on us, radius 40 light-years. Huge, fishy eyes blinked. "Acknowledged." Spike disappeared in a scatter of pixelation. A moment later, a sphere appeared before me, filled with numerous points of light, all conveniently labeled. All the star systems within 40 light-years of Delta Eridani, categorized by stellar type. I drew a line with my finger from Delta Eridani to Gamma Leporis A, Bender's presumed flight path. He'd taken off in the right direction back in 2165, but had never reached the destination. The options were foul play, misadventure, or deliberate decision. The first 2 explanations might leave some kind of trace. Debris, cross-trail of some theoretical attacking force, radioactivity, whatever. The third would at least show up as a redirected Bussard trail, but to detect any of those alternatives, I'd have to be crawling along at 5% of C. That would require 320 years to completely scan Bender's projected path. Of course, if I found something, I wouldn't do the whole route, but it would still be a whole lot of not very much for a long time. We're immortal, being computers, but we also operate at millisecond resolutions, so several hundred years would be an eternity to me. Now, back to the third option, deliberate decision. If Bender had noticed something and turned to investigate it, perhaps someone following his path would see the same thing. Luke and the others hadn't noticed anything, but they had probably been closely scrutinizing their own course rather than looking around. Bender, facing a long interstellar jump in pre-Scut days, would have been looking for something to cut the tedium. I tapped my chin for a few milliseconds, working through the options, then turned to Guppy again. "I think I need to attack this from all angles. Have the autofactories build 100 or so of those long-range scouts we used in the Battle of 82 Eridani. Make sure their surge drives are powerful enough for interstellar travel." "Acknowledged." Once the drones were ready, I would send them along Bender's projected path at 5% C, looking for anything unusual. Meanwhile, there was no reason for me to wait around. I treated myself to one last, long look at the planet Eden rotating below me, then left orbit, heading for Gamma Leporis A at 5G. Travel between stellar systems is uneventful. Thank God. It's hard to think of something eventful out between the stars that wouldn't leave me as a cloud of free-floating atoms. I considered limiting myself to 0.75 C so that I could continue to interact with the bobbiverse in general. Scott allowed instantaneous communications over BobNet, but if my tau got too high, or too low, there was some argument about how we should be expressing Tau, I wouldn't be able to interact in real time, even frame-jacked. But I was just too impatient to test my theory, and anyway, the bobbiverse was starting to get weird and cliquish these days. Bobs were getting less Bob-like and going off in directions that I think would have left original Bob baffled. Well, if they hit the singularity or something while I was out of touch, hopefully Bill would leave a note with instructions. I passed the time by reviewing my archived surveillance vids of the Deltans, a primitive race of humanoids. The Deltans resembled a sort of bipedal pig-bat mashup. I'd more or less adopted them and become the great sky god for a generation or two before joining the tribe in android form. It had been 63 years since I'd walked out of Camelot for the last time, after Archimedes' funeral. I desperately missed my friends and the feeling of family that I got from living among them. Bill had scolded me on more than one occasion about the dangers of transferring my affections to a bunch of alien primitives. Well, tough. As it turned out, things got interesting before I even got up enough Tau to drop out of touch. About 2 months subjective time into the voyage, something triggered one of the monitoring scripts that I'd set up. We were playing baseball in the Bob Moot VR when a guppy popped in unannounced. Every Bob on the field stopped dead. Having someone's guppy show up in the moot couldn't be anything but interesting. Metadata indicated that he was mine, so I put down the bat and gave him a raised eyebrow. As usual, he completely ignored it. Facial expressions didn't mean much to the guppy interface. Or sarcasm, metaphor, irony, body language, or social conventions, for that matter. Guppy stared back, waiting for me to say something. Well, apparently, that was enough.
Astronomical monitoring has picked up an anomaly. You asked to be advised immediately.
Anomaly to Guppy could mean anything, though. Mario's Guppy had once reported an entire dead planetary ecosystem as an anomaly. Luke and Marvin rushed over and hovered. They knew I was following Bender's trail, and this might be news. I glanced at them, then said to Guppy, "Elaborate."
System Eta Leporis displays unusual infrared signature, together with periodic dimming of the star's light.
Luke and Marvin exchanged a glance. Then Luke said, "Like a Dyson swarm signature? You think there's some sort of megastructure? Bender would have investigated that." By now most of the field was gathering around us. Baseball was doubtless done for the day, an opinion that Bill shared. "All right, guys, I think we're done. I'll waive the 5-inning minimum for this week. To the pub!" The players gave a ragged cheer, then began to pop out of the baseball VR. I dismissed Guppy, then transferred to the pub VR with Luke and Marvin and signaled the resident Jeeves for my usual. We grabbed a table and Luke glared at me. "Okay, talk." Well, you guys know I've been scanning for anything unusual around me as I follow Bender's original flight path. My theory is that he saw something and changed course, and we've just been unable to pick up the faint bend in the Bassard Trail. Yeah, get to the punchline. I gave Luke a smile that said, "I'm going to draw this out as much as I can," and continued. Granted, I had no idea what Bender might have been watching for and what he might have seen, so I've been basically looking for everything I could possibly imagine. I've had to double Guppy's memory so he could keep up. "And you found a megastructure signature?" "I appear to have found something that could be interpreted that way. The question is, do I commit to a course change to investigate? If it turns out to be a false alarm, I'll basically have to almost start over from Delta Eridani. Forget the time required to circle around. Eventually, between all our follow-up trips, we'll have trashed up the interstellar medium so much we'll never learn anything." "I think you have to, Bob," Marvin said. "If it comes down to it, I can order the Delta Eridani AMI to build a new heaven vessel in Matrix. Then I'll clone myself into it. That'll be faster than you circling around or one of us heading over." "Fair enough. Give me a second." I popped back into my personal VR. Guppy was, as usual, standing at parade rest. For the millionth time, I wondered if I should retire the Admiral Akbar image. And for the millionth time, my juvenile sense of humor balked. Turn us to head for the anomaly, Guppy. Let me know estimated travel time when you're done. Low priority. Don't pop into the mood for that.
Acknowledged.
I popped back to Marvin and Luke to find Luke tasting my beer. Hey, boundaries, guys? What, I'm going to give you germs? Luke grinned at me. That's a pretty good red. I was a little surprised, since I remember us as a mostly dark beer drinker. Blame Howard. Vulcan has a thriving beer industry, and Howard keeps transferring the templates into VR. He introduced me to this last time I visited. Marvin nodded slowly. He's setting up interstellar trade routes. I frowned. With transit times of years? Turns out you can, oh great all-father. Stasis pods are highly effective for preserving beer. I glared at Marvin, both for the correction and the glib dig. I thought he got rid of his interest in Enniscorthy Distillery. He did. Gave it all to original Bridget and Stefan, and her kids inherited it when she died, but Enniscorthy specialized in hard spirits. Remember the great Romulan presidential scandal? The thought made us all laugh. Cranston had deserved every bit of what was done to him and had never been able to come up with any evidence that Howard engineered the whole thing. Howard and Bridget bought up a few microbreweries on Vulcan. Marvin continued. And it would seem they have some kind of natural talent for the creation and marketing of the Devil's Brew. Or maybe just good business sense. They're now one of the 3 biggest breweries in the Omicron Squared Eridani system. I tapped my chin with a finger as I thought it through. A nervous tick that I seem to have developed all on my own. Original Bob had never done that, nor did any of my clones. Well, you can't print liquids, and there's no point in emailing the recipe without having the actual ingredients available, so I guess physical exports are the only way. I raised my glass in salute. Here's to Howard, the family entrepreneur. I glanced around the pub as I slowly sipped my beer. There seemed to be a lot more variation in dress and style these days, and the clumps of Bobs had a tendency to match, as if we were self-filtering by fashion sense. I could swear that some of them were just short of cosplay. Oh, there were no Klingons or Chewbacca strutting around, but some of the clothing was reminiscent of TNG uniforms or Jedi robes. There was even a Bob in a suit and tie. Why, in God's name, would anyone voluntarily wear a suit and tie? I frowned and tilted my head in the direction of the suit, glancing at Marvin. He replied with a baffled smile and a shrug. Don't ask me, Bob. Replicative drift seems to be accelerating. I think we're approaching 15 to 20 generations, and it's no longer just a matter of enhanced or suppressed attributes of original Bob. The differences are accumulating, and some clones are going in completely new directions. Uh-huh. And the almost cosplay outfits? Marvin's bemused expression didn't change. Some of those are probably just for fun, or making an ironic commentary, but the rest, well, I'm not sure if the clothes are influencing the attitudes or the other way around. The TNG guys are talking about forming an actual organization in the vein of Starfleet to monitor, that's the word they're using, the bobbiverse's effect on biologicals. Oh, good grief. And how are they going to do that? Pass laws? Create a police force? I think it's just discussion, Bob. No one is actually pushing for organizational changes. At least not yet. Is this anything to do with Thor and his lobby group after the war with the others? Not really, no. Thor and his group were stating their preferences, not trying to impose anything on the rest of us. This, Marvin made a small gesture toward the TNG guys, has a more intrusive feel about it, if you get my drift. I shook my head, refusing to give the matter any more psychic energy. I raised a hand, and Jeeves appeared with another beer. I popped into my personal VR, sporting a pleasant beer buzz and a not-so-pleasant feeling of foreboding. I dismissed the beer buzz, but couldn't do the same for the foreboding. Bill was right that I didn't go to Moots often enough, but today's revelations hadn't been the kind of thing that would encourage me to do so. I had recently added an outside patio to my library, complete with deck furniture. The weather was perpetually late summer, early fall, with warm sun and a cool breeze. Loons called across the lake, competing with geese and other waterfowl. Sighing with contentment, I settled into a lounge chair, then invoked Guppy. "Fire up Spike and Jeeves, please, then update me on the course change." Jeeves appeared at my elbow with a pot of coffee and some small sandwiches with no crusts. Spike appeared on my lap, right where she'd been when I suspended her program. I scratched the cat's ear, and she began purring. Finally, sandwich in one hand and coffee in the other, I was ready for business. Status?
En route to Eta Leporis. Travel time approximately 35 years, including time required to change direction.
Wow, that's a hike. Will we be in Scut range when we get there?
Negative. It will be necessary to construct and deploy an inter-system relay station.
Crap, more wasted time. Well, it couldn't be helped. I wasn't about to do a side hop to some nothing system just to build a communications station so I could still access BobNet. Of course, if Eta Leporis had no suitable raw materials when I got there, I was going to look pretty foolish. All right, Guppy, send orders to the trailing drones to adopt a minimum time flight plan to get to where we changed course. I want the whole area mapped in detail, looking for Bussard Trail spoor.
Acknowledged. They will require approximately 24 months.
Noted. Let me know when they arrive and start mapping, and give me the completed report as soon as it's received. Guppy blinked huge fish eyes and disappeared. I settled back into my lazy boy and put my hands behind my head. First problem, communications. I could maybe build a communications relay station when I reached Eta Leporis and send it back along my route to the halfway point. That was suboptimal, though. Beside the uncertainty of materials availability at my destination, I'd be out of touch for years. More years, I mean. Instead, I could direct the Delta Iridini Auto Factory to build a full-sized relay station with a surge drive and send it out. That would be faster, since I could get it started immediately, but this option would still leave at least some gap during which I'd be incommunicado. To handle that gap, I could take one of the drones in my hold, modify it to act as a Scut relay station, and drop it off en route with orders to decelerate to zero velocity. It wouldn't be ideal. No repair or upgrade capability for starters, and not a lot of bandwidth with the size limitation. Well, I wouldn't be running any moots from Eta Leporis anyway. I could live with that, and I could stock it with some spare roamers in case of breakdowns. Anyway, it only had to operate for a couple of years until the much larger and more powerful station from Delta Iridini was in position, and investment of equipment was minimal. I had enough spare drones and roamers in my hold for basic necessities. Okay, one problem solved. I queued up the required tasks on my to-do. Next, the Bender problem. Item. There was a good chance that Bender had veered off and headed for Eta Leporis, but if that turned out to be wrong, I'd receive the report from my trailing drones long before I got there. I'd let Marvin know and be able to swing around to pick up the trail again, so for the sake of argument, consider that a given. Item. Eta Leporis displayed characteristics suggesting a spacefaring intelligence lived there, one that had built or was building a megastructure. That thought brought back memories of the others. I shuddered at the possibility of another protracted interstellar war. Item. If you accepted that a spacefaring civilization had built some kind of megastructure and Bender had changed course to investigate it, then it was highly probable that something had happened to Bender in Eta Leporis. Otherwise, he'd have built a space station, which would be transmitting his logs back toward human space via radio by now. He'd also have long since received the Scut plans and already be on BobNet thanks to instantaneous communications. Conclusion? Caution is highly indicated. I chuckled at the dry bureaucratese in that statement. Still, it was true. We normally approached a system at a tangent rather than diving straight for the star, but we retained enough velocity to turn in system in minimal time. Maybe a parking orbit in the Oort would be a better first step this time, and heavy use of exploration scouts. Not cloaked, though. Cloaking interfered with SUDAR, our subspace version of radar. I rubbed my eyes with thumb and forefinger, an action that had no real point in VR except that it felt good, and started an inventory of onboard assets. I would have to do some in-flight manufacturing. Wouldn't that be fun? 3. Trouble. Bob, September 2331, outskirts, Eta Leporis. I came to a stop, relatively speaking, more than 50 AU out from Eta Leporis. The definitions of Kuiper and Oort regions were completely arbitrary, especially for a system other than Sol, but there were some practical differences. For instance, matter became increasingly scarce farther out, and metallic deposits became harder to find. The physics of stellar system formation seemed to produce some consistent patterns, one of which was that the heavier elements tended to be closer in and all the ice and frozen gases congregated farther out. In the Kuiper and Oort zones, it was almost all frozen clumps of condensed gases ejected from the inner system when the sun ignited. But, like raindrops, they generally condensed around something. My first task would be to send scouts out to look for useful materials. This part fell within my original design. A von Neumann probe needed to find raw materials, refine them, and use them to manufacture more von Neumann probes. Of course, I'd long since exceeded my original design specifications, but it was still relaxing, like doing a routine and mindless task. This process would take a while, though, which was making me antsy. After years in interstellar space, it might seem odd to be fretting over a question of months, but I'd been frame-jacked way down for most of the trip. I was here now, and I wanted to get moving on my search. And not to put too fine a point on it, I wanted to see if there was really a megastructure in the system. The other's Dyson sphere was the only other piece of mega-engineering we'd ever seen, and that had been only partly constructed. That the others might be here seemed unlikely, but it would certainly be a worst-case scenario. My current orbit was too far out to resolve anything in the inner system with the onboard telescope. That was frustrating, and my immediate urge was to send in some observation drones. But Bender had probably just gone charging in, and that presumably had not worked out well for him. So, like it or not, a slow, careful exploration of the system was in order. I spent the time deploying my printers and setting up a proper orbital autofactory. Regardless of what I found in the system proper, I would still have to set up a local communication station. In my idle moments, I checked my message backlog. It was huge after a few decades out of touch, but I was mostly interested in messages from my trailing drones. I filtered for those. The drones launched from Delta Eridani after I'd left had indeed found that Bender's trail turned toward Eta Leporis, and only a fraction of a light month before the point where I made that same turn. The fact made me feel more confident about my deductions, and about my plan of action, and slightly smug. It took 4 months to locate enough material to even make a start on my plans. Transport drones brought mined material back to the auto factory, which slowly churned out finished parts according to the schedule and plans that I'd given Guppy. Roamers assembled drones from the parts and slowly constructed the relay station. A year after arriving, I finally had enough exploration drones to begin the actual search for Bender. In all that time, I hadn't contacted anyone other than having a couple of email exchanges with Bill. First, because I didn't want people breathing down my neck demanding constant updates. And second, because with the small temporary relay station, all I would be able to manage would be audio and video streams. Bob time? Face Bob? It didn't sound likely to catch on. I ordered local drones to trace an expanding spiral looking for Bender's trail into this system. The cross-section they had to examine wasn't all that big. not for devices with a 4 light-hour detection radius. And finally, success. Bender had reached here, and Bender had apparently entered the system. I plotted his approach vector and assigned some drones the task of following his flight path. The closer I got to possibly finding Bender, the more excited I got, but at the same time, I became more nervous. The whole history of our interactions with the others kept coming back. Unpleasant surprises, Bob's getting blown up. Hal got blown up by them, twice? 3 times? I didn't want stories to be told around VR campfires about the demise of Bob 1, but if it did happen, I wanted the other Bobs to know. So I found myself reluctant to commit to anything that might put me in danger until the day the interstellar relay station came online. It had taken a little longer than expected for the Delta Eridani Auto Factory to construct and deploy the station, and the delay was maddening. But finally, the day arrived when the new station signaled readiness and came online. I mothballed the kludgy drone relay station, checked my bandwidth, and performed a long overdue backup to Bill's monster Epsilon Eridani archive, Ultima Thule. I held off on updating my blog. I wanted to have something dramatic to post first. I'd been doing some light astronomy while waiting for the auto factory to build things and for the drones to find things. I had already identified 6 planets, the second of which was in the habitable zone. I'd also identified a gap between the second and third planets, which was where the infrared signature was coming from. I couldn't resolve anything in that zone, and the signature was coming from all the way around the star, so my money was on some kind of swarm, possibly the beginnings of a Dyson swarm, but concentrated in the ecliptic. If that was the case, and the swarm consisted of something in the order of O'Neill cylinders, it would make sense that I wouldn't be able to make out any detail yet. The planet in the habitable zone, Planet 2, didn't appear to be inhabited, or at least there wasn't any kind of radio signature. Nevertheless, I was getting something sporadic from the system in general, like chirps, very short-lived and seemingly random noise, except for the narrow transmission spectrum, which was exactly what I'd expect to see if someone was encrypting and compressing their communications. So something was alive. It might be time to rejoin the bobbiverse. I could use some other perspectives on this. The blat of the air horn was answered by the traditional booing as the audience expressed their love. Bill grinned back from the podium. Yeah, okay. Today's meet includes an update from Bob 1. Bill was forced to wait for a wave of catcalls and cheers to die down. On the subject of Bender and the situation in Eta Leporis. This produced a silence far more profound than the earlier noise. Bender's disappearance had become the Bobbiverse's version of the Flying Dutchman legend. I waved my hand in the air and smiled as heads turned to look at me, but I was perplexed. The Bobs have always been irreverent and disrespectful, and I was no stranger to jeers and insults at moots, but this time it hadn't been just good fun. There had been a discernible undertone of rancor. Keeping my expression neutral, I stepped up onto the podium and scanned the crowd. Undertone or not, everyone was paying attention. I'm sure most of what I'm about to tell you is already circulating as scuttlebutt, so I'll keep it brief, then answer questions. I gave them the same capsule summary that I'd already shared with Bill, then asked for questions. Hands went up everywhere, and I pointed at random. Are you just going to go barreling in without any thought of consequences? My eyebrows went up in surprise. The tone and the words were deliberately confrontational. I took a second to look at the speaker to make sure he wasn't a non-Bob replicant, but no such luck. I found myself more irritated than I would be if some random person had challenged me. This felt like a betrayal. Have you ever known a Bob to go barreling in without any planning? Have you met us? I glared at him, daring him to argue. If this does turn out to be a native civilization, you could be interfering in their development. Will you confirm that you'll back off to avoid doing that? Wow, I replied. Nice use of a prejudicial term. To answer the actual question rather than the accusation, that will depend on circumstances. Signing on to a blanket policy at this point would be ridiculous. At one end of the scale, this putative civilization might have